Depressive disorders. Major depression is a form of depression that does not alternate with mania, which is mania is like extreme like happiness. It's not just like a normal happy, but um, like extreme, like an over the top. It is normal to become depressed after a sad or unfortunate event, but if a person remains depressed weeks or months after that event, it may be classified as major depression. Major depression does not give way to manic episodes like we talked about earlier. And that's one of the things with disorders is a lot of disorders, occur naturally. Like it's natural to be sad. But how do we, distinguish between sadness and depression? And that's why we have the DSM, right? So, the book of all mental disorders to tell us, what kind of classifies what symptoms, classifies as a mental disorder. And a lot of this has to do with culture as well. So, some cultures say you can be sad for this long, right? You have a certain mourning period, and other cultures don't. So it does vary between cultures as well. But a lot of these things, there's a lot of gray area there, right? Because it's natural to be sad, but, to some extent, eventually, you would need to get over it for it not to be considered like a mental disorder. So if you can't, once again, if you can't have a functioning uh, life, like if you can't get out of bed, if you can't go to work, that's when it starts to become a clinically depressed and not just sad. So major depression, by many accounts, depression is underdiagnosed and undertreated. So a lot of people, have depression, but something we call well a lot of things like functional, right? So they can kind of get through their life, but they're still depressed. So a lot of it isn't diagnosed. So globally speaking, studies indicate that depression is the single most prevalent disability. While some differences may be a result of reporting, other factors seem to be at work too. So if you look at like Taiwan and Korea, like they have a very low divorce rate. Lebanon, you know, has a very high death rate due to war. A lot of wars going on in the Middle East. So if you look at the chart on the right, it just says lifetime risk of depressive episode lasting a year or more. Notice Taiwan and Korea have very low, rates. They have very low divorce rates. So, think about maybe what's going on in the culture. Lebanon has a lot of war. They have a high depression rate. If you have war going on around you, I could see that leading to depression. And you see, you can kind of go through there and look at the different countries and their rates of depression. And think what could cause some of these countries to have higher or lower rates of depression. Could it have something to do with their location, their environment, maybe being in darkness a lot, some other aspect of their culture? So think about that as you're looking at that chart. Persistent depressive disorder. And a lot of times, if you notice, I have disorders like other things in parentheses. That was the old name for it. So the DSM-5, which came out in May of 2013, that's the current one that we use. The one before that, the DSM-4, actually TR text revision. So the ones in parentheses, those are the old names that you're going to see throughout this unit. So persistent depressive disorder is characterized by chronic depression, but with less severity than major depression. So symptoms, daily depressed mood for at least 2 years, low energy, sleep or appetite disturbances, and low self-esteem. So it's not as like chronic as major depression. So a lot of times they have these symptoms. They're always like low energy, not in a good mood, but they can, still get out of bed, maybe still go to work. Causes of depression. Some causes of major depression involve genetic predispositions. Severe bouts of depression often run in families. We've talked about this before. There is a genetic you know, link to depression, but it is also a combination with the environment. So a lot of people might have this, genetic link, but something usually has to cause it to kind of go off, some kind of traumatic event, and that's why two people can go through the same traumatic event, and one person it leads to depression, the other person it might not. So further indication of biological basis for depression are that drugs that affect the brain's level of certain neurotransmitters are very effective. However, biology alone cannot account for everything. So we talked about, nature and nurture. We talked about the different approaches to psychology, the cognitive approach, behavioral approach, the biological approach. Well, when we talk about, like I said, the second half of this unit is going to be the treatments and therapies. Well, we know that there is a medical approach to depression. We do know there's an imbalance of neurotransmitters. So drugs can help fix that balance of neurotransmitters. So we do know there is a biological cause to this. The cognitive explanations. All right, so now we're talking about the cognitive approach. Probably because of low self-esteem, depression-prone people are more likely to perpetuate the depression cycle by attributing negative events to their own personal flaws or external conditions they feel helpless to change. So Martin Seligman calls this learned helplessness. All right, so we've talked about this before, where you get in this pattern, like something bad happens to you, so then you just feel helpless, and then you don't kind of like try anymore. And so this is that cognitive explanation of it. You kind of fall into that cycle. Also, if you remember, we talked about like locus of control. So if you have more of an external locus of control, you feel like it's just out of your hands. It's just kind of up to fate. You don't kind of control what happens to you. So you'd be more likely to fall into this. So cognitive behavioral cycle of depression. So you can just see how this thing cycles around. So let's say you have a negative event, right? Something bad happens to you. Same thing with like the learned helplessness we talked about. So let's say Fred decides to be more sociable, but when he asked Teresa for a date, she already had plans. This leads Fred to have low self-esteem and negative interpretations, right? Fred concludes that he is not very interesting or attractive and that people don't like him. This leads Fred to become depressed, right? He feels completely alone and unhappy. This leads Fred to have negative behaviors. So Fred avoids people, skips school, and neglects his personal hygiene. This leads to social rejection and loneliness. Because of Fred's negative behaviors, people avoid him, reinforcing his symptoms, right? So he avoids people, he doesn't take care of himself, so then that leads to people not wanting to be around him. Now that leads back to these negative events. Now people don't want to be around him, which then leads to more low self-esteem and depression, and you see how the cycle goes around. So a lot of it has to do with the interpretation of it. That's the cognitive approach to it. So if he would have just interpreted it, oh, maybe she was just busy, and doesn't, and that doesn't lead to low self-esteem, which might not lead to depression, right? So a lot of it has to do with interpretation of things. So continuing on with the cognitive approach, the cognitive approach to depression points out that negative thinking styles are learned and modifiable, right? So a lot of times you have learned to think this way, right? To think negatively. So think about like classical and operant conditioning we talked about before. Like you were rewarded or punished for thinking a certain way, so that so that kept you thinking a certain way. But because you have learned to think that way, you can also unlearn to think that way. It's usually harder to unlearn something, but it is possible, and that's where the therapy comes in. And we'll talk about the cognitive approach to therapy. So Beck's basics. So Aaron Beck suggests that depression is a result of negative thinking, which he called negative errors, right? Which is just errors in logic. So Beck identified 3 negative thoughts that seemed to be really automatic and occurred without delay in depressed patients. He called it the cognitive triad, right? Triad, meaning 3. So first we have self. So a lot of negative thoughts about ourself. Then the external world. We think about the world around us as being negative. I mean, I see this all the time now where people, pretty much think the world's ending, right? There's no positive in it. And then the future, right? Negative thoughts about the future. Pretty much like, for me, like I always try to think about how optimistic the future can be, but these people would think the opposite, right? That they have no future, right? Their life is going nowhere. So Beck believes that faulty thinking leads to depression. The question remains though, which came first, depression or their faulty thoughts? All right, so were you depressed and therefore you started thinking this way? Or because you were thinking this way, it led to depression? Right, it's the whole chicken and the egg thing. And there's been a couple of these situations we've talked about this year, which you can argue back and forth either way. There is no necessarily right or wrong answer, but a lot of good theories about it. So, who becomes depressed? Studies show that depression rates are higher in women. The difference may be in the way men and women handle emotional situations. Women tend to be introspective, so they tend to think about their feelings and what may be causing them. Men, on the other hand, try to distract themselves from the depressed feelings. Right? So, men, we typically try to avoid them. We don't want to deal with them. Right? We want to distract ourselves from them. That is why men tend to explode more because they don't deal with them as much. So this suggests the more ruminative, which is a vocab word, just means compulsive fretting, overthinking about our problems and their causes. Response of women increases their vulnerability to depression, right? They tend to like overthink things, constantly, you know, have them on their mind, and that, with a lot of different situations, but when it comes to, their feelings and stuff like that, that can lead them to becoming more depressed. So, depression kind of breeds depression. Increasing rates of depression. Rates of depression have increased 10 to 20 times what they were 50 years ago. So, I mean, obviously that's a lot. So then we have to look at, well, why is that? Right? So the average age of people experiencing depression has actually gone down. So now it's younger and younger people are experiencing depression. So we have to look at why that might be. And so, we'll go over a few of these and think about, you know, do you agree with it? Are there any other possible reasons why? So Seligman identifies three causes of this trend. Number one, out of control individualism, self-centeredness. Right? So our culture has definitely changed. So our culture now focuses on individual successes and failures rather than group accomplishments. Right? So, we live in an individualistic society, and it has become even more, individualistic as the years have gone on. Where before, we would come together. So think about like World War II. The country came together. Everyone, well, a lot of people volunteered to fight. All right, so it's a lot different then than it is now. We're definitely more individualistic now than we were back then. So because of that, we look at each of our own individual failures more than we would before. Number two, the self-esteem movement. The teaching a generation of children they should feel good about themselves, irrespective of their efforts and achievements. So this is the whole participation trophy, which I am very much against. And they've been doing this now for 15, 20 years at least, where, you get, oh, everyone, they feel bad because they didn't win. Well, now, we have to help their self-esteem, which obviously you want people to have high self-esteem, but now they expect to get something without doing the work. And this has led to depression because when something bad is going to happen, which it's going to happen eventually in their life, right? So it leads to more depression because of how they've been treated growing up. So a lot of these, I've mentioned this before about nature, but there's also a lot of nurture that's at play when we talk about these different disorders. And we definitely see this with depression. So it's just the self-esteem movement, it's the participation trophy that kids expect to get rewarded even though they didn't put in the work. So even think, I mean, I see this at school, right? So obviously, um, teaching AP, IB honors classes, so it's usually the better students, but there are some students that definitely expect to get certain grades just for showing up to school. And that's because that's what's happened to them before, right? They don't necessarily feel like they have to, necessarily do the work. They think turning in anything should count. And so obviously there's a lot of different theories about this, but, this has been a result of the self-esteem movement, right? And I understand why this happened, obviously you wanted, kids to feel good about themselves, and obviously we all do, but there are consequences of that, and so we need to learn how we can keep their self-esteem high, but yet not coddle them where they think they deserve everything. So I saw this one psychologist speak, and he talked about, what is, I'm not sure if he was talking about abuse, but I think I've given this example before. He's like, what if you give a kid like a Skittle every day, and one day you don't give him Skittles? He's gonna feel like he was like being abused, like something's wrong, when really you just didn't give him Skittles. You're not doing anything wrong, but that's what he expects, and so we kind of see this with the self-esteem movement. The third thing, we have a culture of victimology, a reflective pointing the finger of blame at someone or something else. So we have a movement of people not taking responsibility for their own actions. And because of this, this leads to that negative thinking and to depression. So, these are three things that he identified. And if you think about it, they do make sense. I'm sure some of you guys would argue with that, and I welcome that argument. But, these three things, they do make sense if you look at them, and why depression's increasing, but increasing at a younger age, where now it's not just adults getting it, but it's teenagers, it's even younger. I mean, you have elementary kids being diagnosed with depression. So it's younger and younger, and a lot of it has to do with these three things. I'm not saying you have to get rid of them altogether, but there has to, something has to be worked out with it. So depression on the brain, right? I found that the brain is less active during depression than it is during mania. So, manic episodes, so when we talk about bipolar, it used to be called manic depressant, where you're manic and depressed. So manic is those high states, depression is those low states. We have found that the brain's not, working, isn't as active. But we also found a lot of those, neurotransmitters at work here are lacking. Norepinephrine increases arousal and boosts mood, is scarce during depression and overabundant during mania. So a lot of these things, like we talked about when we talked about the brain, if you have too little of something, it causes one thing. If you have too much of something, it causes something else. All right, so too little of this causes depression, too much causes mania. Serotonin, once again, we see this is scarce during depression. Dopamine, a chemical that's associated with enhancing mania. So, we've learned that, through these neurotransmitters, we can take drugs that help with them, right? Help with the balance, right? Because a lot of depression is just a chemical imbalance. So we found drugs that can increase, these neurotransmitters by blocking their reuptake. This helps relieve depression. And one of the major ones is the serotonin reuptake inhibitor. All right, the last slide, bipolar. Now with the new DSM, which isn't so new anymore, but bipolar is its own category, where it used to be part of depression. Formerly known as manic depressive disorder, bipolar disorder is a mental abnormality involving swings of mood from mania to depression. There's a strong genetic component is well established, although the exact genes involved are not known. So 1% of the population has bipolar attacks. Having an identical twin with the problem inflates a person's chances by about 70%. All right, so we know there's that genetic connection there, because if one twin has it, the other twin's 70% likely to get it. And it's kind of like on a spectrum. All right, so you have your normal moods, and then you have hypomania, which is mild to moderate mania, and then you have severe mania. Then you have mild to moderate depression, and then you have severe depression. All right, so it's on the spectrum that you have your events. And now there's actually two bipolars. There's like a bipolar 1 and a bipolar 2. So, and the main difference is it's the severity of the manic episodes you have. So a person with bipolar 1 will experience a full manic episode, while a person with bipolar 2 will experience only like hypomanic episodes, right? So their manic episodes don't get that severe.